Chair of Wisdom time. Martin Esser writes, did the countries take regular surveys of public opinion? Did they know about the unpopularity of the war? Governments would often be able to judge public mood and morale while they censored correspondence. The Russian and Central Powers governments set up censorship postal boards to decipher what the popular mood of the time was. The Russians even took this further by having informers eavesdrop on people's conversations and categorize moods as being indifferent, patriotic, or depressed. This was done not entirely to prevent civilian unrest, but also to turn public morale to their favor. The German districts also had to produce monthly reports on the mood of their populations. They accumulated the information necessary in a similar fashion to the Russians, with secret informers as well as military representatives and policemen. The Habsburgs were especially keen to note civilian moods by nationality, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire especially began to fracture along ethnic lines. Italy and France, they also had their own surveillance system and censorship boards for military correspondence. Now, as the war dragged on into the year of battles, 1916, it was quite obvious without informers that war weariness was beginning to set in. Discontent could be seen in every belligerent country, as the battles of 1916 saw heavy casualties, but very little movement. Tomasz Mazurek writes, how useful were spies during the Great War? Watching the show so far, I can see propaganda warnings about spies, people being accused of being spies, but very few cases of successful spying activity all during the course of the war, maybe save for Edward Lawrence and the British cutting the German underseas cables. Intelligence was often gathered by airplane or by the interrogation of prisoners captured in, say, nighttime trench raids. But usually, this was only piecemeal information, so spies were sent behind enemy lines to find out about major troop movements and strategies. The Allies never managed to set up a successful network of spies in Germany, but they were able to create damaging spy networks in the occupied territories of northern France and Belgium. The spies themselves were usually refugees from Belgium and France and were sent behind German lines via neutral Holland or by airplane. These spies would in turn recruit spies already in the occupied territory, who were spurred on by their hatred of the Germans as well as financial compensation for the hardships of occupation. Their main task was to report train schedules, so that the Entente powers were able to pinpoint German troop movements. In addition to this, they had to report on the state of German airfields, ammunition dumps, and, other enemy positions. A lot of this information was conveyed via carrier pigeon. The spy networks grew in size throughout the war, and in 1918, the largest syndicate of them all, La Dame Blanche, had around 1,000 informers. Now, the German spies had a tougher time, as they had to operate in territory with a hostile civilian population. Spies operating in Britain and France mainly worked in isolation, since they could not rely on recruiting others where they were stationed. Intelligence sent back to German high command was, because of this, generally poor quality. The Germans had better luck in the East, where they were able to recruit disaffected Polish and Baltic state nationals who had suffered from the abuses of the retreating Russian army. The infiltration of spies into Russian territory was also much easier because of the lack of a continuous front line of trenches. Milo Martin writes, hi Indy, for Out of the Trenches, was conscription universal to all belligerents regardless of social class, i.e. Ireland, USA, Australia? And did the civilian population generally support a draft? God bless Texas, First Sergeant Milo, U.S. Army. Well, I'm also from Texas, so hey, why not? Conscription varied from country to country. Where conscription existed, it did apply to everyone, regardless of your social background. In Australia, you mentioned Australia, in Australia there were 2 referendums about the controversial topic of conscription, since new volunteers just simply couldn't keep up with the number of losses. Now, on both of these occasions, the Australian public narrowly rejected conscription. But both New Zealand and Britain itself introduced conscription in 1916, and the Canadians followed suit in 1917. French Canadians were largely against this draft, as they believed that their rights in Canada were not assured, so they didn't see the point in fighting for those rights in Europe. In addition to this, Canadians from Quebec did not consider Britain as their mother country, and because of their centuries-long separation from France, did not see France really as the alternative. The Conscription Act caused long-term rifts between British and French Canadians. In addition to this, and this is interesting, 94% of those conscripted in Canada applied for exemption. Ireland had been exempted from conscription in 1916, but by 1918, the British government tried to bring it to the entire United Kingdom. However, there was a huge backlash against this. So once the Americans joined the war and started coming in force, and the fear of the growing unrest in Ireland, the government decided to withdraw that idea. Other countries had introduced conscription before the war, as it was more culturally acceptable, such as France, which introduced the 3-year law in 1913. Germany also had a similar system adopted for peacetime. Speaking of Canada, if you'd like to see our special about Canada and World War I, you can click right here for that. You should also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter to see all kinds of cool stuff that Flo, our social media guy, puts up there. See you next time.